Welcome to Game of the Day, where I randomize a date and play a game that came out on that same day. Today we're starting with 1998 for the year and August 30th for the date. There were 10 games released on today's date, and I was secretly hoping it landed on NFL Game Day 99 with the NFL season right around the corner. Go Ravens! But the wheel had other plans as we landed on Future Cop LAPD for today's game. It starts with a CGI intro showing 2098 crime rate in LA before getting into the details about how the LAPD is using mech suits now to combat gangs and other organizations. For the menu, the two modes that the game had to offer were the Crime War and the Precinct Assault. First, I'll cover the Crime War mode, which acted as a campaign mode where you went into different zones within LA to stop the crime there. The first thing I noticed was that the game used a camera that was changeable, but by default it was set to dynamic, which basically meant it adjusted automatically to fit into the spaces you walked into. At first it wasn't that bad, but as I continued to play the game it became a problem, which I'll explain how later. Second came the attacks you got to use, which consisted of a light attack that was mostly effective on people, a heavy attack that was used for smaller enemies, and a special attack that was used for larger enemies and bosses. The last thing was the controls for the mech suit, which were more complex than I thought it'd be. L1 was used when you had to do precision platforming, but you had the ability to switch between walking mech and a car mech by pressing L1 and R1 at the same time for sections where driving was more useful. But the controls for the walking mech was where it got a little weird. It consisted of your usual analog stick controls, but left and right were directional turns, while L2 and R2, which were supposed to be dodges, felt like drifts, which made sense for how the mech was built, but in terms of intuitiveness it didn't really feel that great to use. Going back to the mission though, the first zone followed criminal Miles Mysterio, who was taking down aircrafts after turning the Park telescope into a plasma cannon, and of course my job was to destroy said cannon. The level itself was pretty well thought out with different puzzles and mini bosses to go throughout it, and it took about 10 minutes to beat from start to finish. But due to how tight some of the areas were, the camera had a tendency to do a ton of swapping around, and since the controls followed whatever target you locked onto, which I will mention was switchable using R1, not only was it hard to see, but it became hard to move too, which got a bit frustrating. As a reward for completing the zone, I unlocked a new light and heavy attack, which was nice for customizing weapon layouts however you wanted. The second zone wasn't as bad, but my main gripe came when I had to find the entrance to progress in the mission that was hidden by the dynamic camera, and for the boss I once again ran into navigation issues as it was a pretty small area where L1 didn't help, but I was able to beat it in 3 attempts. The final mission I tried was a retrieval job, and everything was going pretty well until I got stuck not being able to hear my partner giving my next instruction as the voice line simply stopped, which happened a decent amount, but I'll attribute that to the emulator opposed to a game issue. I overcame that obstacle to only be met with another camera hiding my next objective issue, and I took that as a sign to put down the campaign. The only other thing the game had to offer was a precinct assault mode that was basically capture the flag without having to return back to your base. It was probably a lot more fun with another player, but playing against the CPU it just dragged on for way too long. While the game did have its fair share of quirks I personally didn't enjoy, I appreciated the level design and atmosphere. The combat in the game was super fun, and it shined brightest in open areas where you could just have an all-out battle with enemies, so for that I'd give this game a code 1026 out of 10. Today we're starting with 2008 for the year and January 4th for the date. Another 2-game day as Antbuster and Mario Forever Galaxy go head-to-head for the Game of the Day title, and in the end Antbuster came out victorious. Antbuster is a tower defense game where you defend 8 slices of cake from ants before they can take them and bring them back to their anthill. When the game starts, you have 10 seconds to set up your defenses before the first wave kicks in. So for my first run, as an amateur in the tower defense genre, I had no clue what to do, so I just panicked and put my defenses as close to their anthill for easy points. When I finally made enough off the first few waves, I bought a new cannon and had to decide what upgrades I'd get to bolster my defenses, which is where I'll talk about how many different upgrades this game has. Similar to most games in the genre, there are starter upgrades that branch out into other upgrades depending on what you selected. So you could go from a single cannon to a double cannon to a triple cannon, or a single cannon to a quick cannon to a sniper cannon, and so on and so forth, but in total there are 50 different cannons to choose from. What I found interesting though was at any point you could downgrade and respec into another cannon build you wanted at any time, or just sell the cannon altogether if you wanted to. Being able to do that felt pretty good for pacing purposes. During my first run I invested in mainly triple cannons and poison, but it didn't end up working out so well as they stole cake and troves, so I only ended up getting to level 51 with 6,871 points. But after getting a good feel and understanding for the game, I set my sights on trying to get to 10,000 points in 3 attempts. During my second run I changed my approach to using quick cannons near their anthill, poison in the middle, and heavy cannons near the cake to see how much further I'd get. While playing I figured out another another neat feature which was being able to target which specific ant I wanted to go for, which would be very useful for ants that had cake, but despite my best efforts, I still fell just short by 196 points. With my final attempt coming up and having nothing left to lose, I felt like it was time to make a name for myself and use my final gambit formation. 5 long-range cannons, 2 poison cannons, and a missile launcher. A hard-fought battle between me and the ants waged on, and with each slice of cake they took back to their base, my morale dropped lower, until there was only one piece left. I defended it with my life, but as this last ant marched past all my attacks, I knew it was over. Or so I thought. While the ant AI has been relatively smart and ant-like at avoiding cannons, this specific ant took an extremely long route back to the anthill, which bought me just enough time to get rid of their last hope. So with the biggest obstacle out the way, I was finally able to reach the coveted 10,000 points. While this is just a regular tower defense game, there's no need to reinvent the wheel for it to be fun. Using super ants that could lift an entire slice of cake by themselves as enemies was a good choice, as in real life, it can feel like a tower defense game when you have an invasion of ants coming at you, so there's some real motivation to get them gone. So after conquering the game, I'd give this game a King of the Hill out of 10. Today we're starting with 2021 for the year and July 28th for the date. There were a total of 58 titles released on this day, with some standouts being Paint the Town Red and The Ascent, but the game that ultimately came out on top was The Witch Doctor. The plot of this game is a mouthful, so please bear with me. The Witch Doctor is a role-playing game that follows Lua, who, as the title implies, is a witch doctor that saves Snowfall Village's queen from a sleeping spell cast by another evil witch. She is accompanied by a warrior named Nova, who sees the kindness in Lua despite the village not trusting her intent with the queen due to witch doctors having a bad reputation. That being said, once the queen is stolen by another witch by the name of Mortes, Lua is framed and thrown in prison due to suspicion of working with her. It's later found out that Mortes' main reasoning for stealing the queen is to revive the Gigantos with the key she has, and now it's the job of our party to try and stop her from doing so while saving the queen. Along the way, we're also joined by Rubik, one of the queens of out sorcerers that imprisoned us, and Sagat, the retired priest that's main goal is to help find refugees a safe place to live. After that, it was just mainly the trope of being a second too late to every location Mortes is at, then fighting a boss in her place. Now diving into the gameplay, since the game uses RPG Maker for the engine, it has most of the basic elements you would expect, like healing and stat boost potion, equipable items such as weapons, shields, clothes, etc., a variety of enemies with different weaknesses, critical hits, and more. I encountered about 5 different type of base enemies that either came solo or in a group of 5, and I ran into 2 bosses, but in the end the game itself wasn't all that challenging after about 2 hours, and I didn't really come close to dying at all. Now, as someone whose only RPG experience comes from Pokemon and Clear Obscure Expedition 33, I don't know if this is common, but I did notice that enemies within this game had no health bar or indication if something was super effective or not very effective. There are different elements within the game such as fire, ice, light, and dark, and more, but I didn't really notice any difference between using them on enemies. The only noticeable damage gap came between if an enemy was weak to physical attacks or magical attacks. And to cover another super important aspect in RPGs, the game itself visually looked really nice. I'm not sure if it had an asset pack or it was using original sprites, but nonetheless, from a visual standpoint, I had no problems with how the game looked. Other things I noticed was that the game was controller compatible, which is always a plus. I never got too lost as the game marked your objective with green glowing blobs, and the enemies had no bounds and would follow you across the map to jump you, which funnily enough I kind of enjoyed as it forced me to move smartly or I'd get cornered by like 3 different encounters back to back. But with all that being said, I'd give this game a yep, it's a RPG out of 10. Today we're starting with 1993 for the year and April 30th for the date. To no surprise of longtime viewers of this series, we ran into another date with no game on it, but the closest was Kaiketsu Yanchamaru 3, Taiketsu Zouringen, or Kid Niki 3 as the localized title, which released the day prior, so that's what we'll be looking at today. Immediately from the intro, I could see this took inspiration from Super Mario Bros. With the classic princess stuck in the castle scenario that then transitioned into gameplay, which further solidified my claims. Unlike Mario, our main character Yanchamaru had a few tricks up his sleeve to make this game a standout. There were a ton of different ways to move and attack in this game, which I wasn't expecting. You could spin off of ledges and walls, attack in every direction with your bow, charge up a spinning attack, adjust your jump by how long you held down the button, slide under obstacles, and even bounce on your bow to avoid things such as spikes. In my gameplay, I barely scratched the surface of getting the movement down as it was easy to learn but hard to master, but the gameplay on screen now should give you a better idea of what this game looks like at its full potential. There are also a couple of your standard items thrown in such as invincibility, hearts, and extra lives, with more being accessible to unlock if you were formed well enough to go to the bonus stage that happened after each level. To progress in the game though, there were a couple of locked doors in each of the 7 levels in which you had to find keys to open them. Thankfully, any key could open any door, as well as you didn't need to collect every key in an area as each level had extra keys, so that made things a lot easier. What wasn't as easy though was the game's vast variety of enemies that felt like they were infinitely spawning at points, and taking all of them on while trying to platform and avoid obstacles was a hassle, but it was far from impossible once you got a hang of it. A similar sentiment could be shared with bosses in this game, as there were 5 regular bosses and 2 main bosses, all of which range from extremely easy to decently hard difficulty wise, but once you learned the 2 or so combos each boss had, there wasn't really much to worry about. With that being said, I had a pretty fun time with this game. The completion time is pretty short, taking about 3 hours max. The freedom of control was great, and it offered just enough difficulty to be challenging, but despite that it still felt rewarding, so taking all that into consideration, I'd give this game a bow of mastery out of 10. Today we're starting with 2018 for the year and June 17th for the date. There were 28 games that came out on this date, and the one that we happened to land on turned out to be Esport Manager. This game allows you to create and manage your own esports team that specializes in either FPSs or MOBA games, and there were 3 different difficulties that you could try playing on. I did try both game types, but I like the MOBA version a bit better, so I'll mainly touch on that for the video. The main task is to help your team rise to the top through various different means, such as playing in matches and tournaments, getting sponsorships, managing social media to gain fans, and equipping perks for your team and individual players to use, but these things come at a cost. Anytime a player learns a new perk, you have to pay attention to their morale that is tracked through their exercise, hunger, and rest levels. The lower it is, the worse they perform, and of course, since the primary goal is to win, keeping players in tip-top shape is extremely crucial. It isn't really that hard to boost morale, as you can just send players to designated locations for each issue, and they seem to restore themselves pretty fast, as well as each of these facilities are completely upgradable to make things run more smoothly. Now, getting into the actual gameplay itself, the game allows you to set what game character and class they use, their bottom, mid, or top position, how aggressively they play, and which perks they can equip. For those who like a more hands-on approach, you can upgrade each player mid-match for different weapons and upgrades, as well as can change their position, but as a casual player I just sat back and let the game do that part while I just watched. There were 3 speed settings to watch matches on, as well as you had the capability to simulate matches entirely, which felt like enough control for me to get through them pretty quickly. As you are an esports team, there's an entire league you're a part of that is separated into an amateur, main, and pro conference that uses relegation and promotion for moving teams up and down. The game cycle boiled down to earning skills, managing morale, doing a bunch of sparring matches, and scout the team you face next until you're ready to take them on, rinse and repeat. After going through the cycle for 6 matches, my team was 3-3, needing to win against a ragtag bunch of misfits to advance to the playoffs, but to no one's surprise, the lowest scoring team, who had a singular player with a positive KDR, did not win, so just like that, my season was over. What I will say is I did appreciate the stat tracking the game had for keeping up with all the player stats and team stats across the entire league, which I thought was really cool. To be honest, I didn't really expect much from this game, but despite that, I had a pretty good time. I'm not big into competitive FPS games or MOBA games, but the way the game was able to make it simple enough for anyone to get into it, yet have enough complexity for seasoned players to also enjoy it, was a nice balance that they were able to find. There are some little features that would have been nice to have, such as seeing your entire season schedule past opponents, having more than 2 maps for each game type, or having the ability to even hire or fire players if they weren't performing well. But despite that, it was a fun simulator, so I'd probably give this game a GG no re out of 10. First, I'd like to shout out Kinda Working for reaching out to me on Twitch and making the randomizers we'll be using today. So first we'll start with the 26th of May in 2011 for today's date. And the first game we got was something I can't show or even say the name of on this site, so unfortunately I had to spin again. But the game we ended up getting afterwards was Chou no Doku Hana no Kusari, or Butterflies, Poison, Blood Chains. The game is a romance visual novel that originally was completely in Japanese, but in 2023 it seemed to get a release that included English subtitles, so that's the version I'll be playing. There's also an 18+ version of the game, but for obvious obvious reasons, this video isn't going to cover that content. When I first booted up the game, the first thing I did was going to the settings that let you change the font, text speed, bubble colors, and more, which for a visual novel having all these options was optimal, so things were off to a great start. But the story follows Yuriko no Miya, or whatever you want to name her, as the name was changeable, in 1918 Tokyo, and her debt-riddled noble family who happened to be throwing her an extravagant birthday party she wasn't all too fond of due to their financial issues, so she gets the bright idea to escape out her window, which brings us to the first possible love interest we're introduced to in her gardener, Majima. Majima tells her not to jump, so she doesn't, in which she's met by her loving father, heavy spending mother, and questionable second love interest in her artistic brother, Mizuhito. They encourage her to come out of her room and greet the party downstairs, which she does before running into her third love interest of Fujita, the family's butler. She speaks with him for a while before he has to leave, then her next love interest of a childhood friend, Hideo, comes into the picture and explains to her that this birthday party was really a setup to find her a husband, as her dad thinks she'd be happier if she married into a wealthier family. She becomes rattled, which only gets worse as her creepy servant comes near her before being told off by a woman love interest this time in Kyoko, who gets close, tell her the rumors are true that she smells like a lily at a certain time of the month, which leads to our main character running outside to get some air. But the trip outside was short-lived as commotion in the house leads her back inside, where she sees it's being ransacked by thugs with swords and almost gets her life taken from her before she's saved by a final love interest in a mysterious man. Unfortunately, in all the commotion though, her father's life was taken, and that's where it all starts to change for her. Keep in mind, all the plot I just covered comes from a portion of the prologue, so there's a lot more that goes on from there. All in all though, the visual novel was a lot, but in a good way. Once in a while you did get to pick dialogue options that had impact on the story, important characters did have voice actors, and the game had a ton of quality of life features and a lot more. The art was also great, but I do feel like characters could have shown a bit more emotion if they were given a couple more poses to choose from. With everything taken into account though, I think I'd give this game a noble romance out of 10. Today we're starting with 1976 for the year and May 11th for the date. While we almost landed in the Game Void for a second time in this series, we fortunately had one game within this month and it turned out to be an all-time classic. No, not that one. Not that one either. No, that's not quite right. There we go. While most of you are probably familiar with the 1978 version for the Atari 2600 that's gotten so popular because it's basically its own genre at this point, even accompanied by an Easter egg on Google, the version I'll be playing is the original arcade one made by Atari as well. The gameplay is pretty simple. You have to hit the ball with the paddle while moving left and right to break blocks that give you points. The further back the block is, the more points you get, the faster the ball begins to move, and if you miss the ball 3 times, it's game over. I set my goal really high at clearing the entire stage, but as I played some more, my expectations dwindled little by little until I just lowered my goal to getting 50 points. Most of the difficulty came from the controls feeling a bit off due to me not being able to play with the arcade cabinet setup and using my keyboard opposed to my mouse that I did eventually end up switching to after about an hour into playing. The rest of the difficulty came down to speed, intuition, and finesse. The strategy that worked best for me is to either trail the ball or slice against it as it came down, as trying to just sit where I thought it'd be then overcorrect when I was off wasn't working out at all. But after about an hour I was able to crush my 50-point goal, putting up some nice scores such as 69 followed up by 74, which was as high as I could get. There was also a 2-player mode which didn't change anything gameplay wise, but just had players taking turns against each other, seeing who could get a higher score. Some small bugs and issues I ran into though were things like blocks being broken even if the surrounding blocks weren't broken yet, or serving the ball was either delayed by a couple of seconds after pressing the button, or on rare occasion it glitched through the blocks and came out as a fastball to start. Once again, while people mainly focus on the Atari 2600 version, the OG definitely laid some pretty strong groundwork. Despite me being pretty bad at the game, I still found myself going back as I genuinely had fun trying to figure out techniques and strategies to become as efficient as possible in this pretty simple game. So I feel like if I were to give any game a title drop score, it'd be this one, as I'm giving this a breakout game out of 10. Today we're starting with 1977 for the year and February 4th for the date. As I went to check for today's game, I realized this month didn't have a single game in it, which landed us in the Game Void. The Game Void is an honorable list that consists of month and year combos without a game in it, so congratulations to May 1977 for being our second entry in the Game Void. That out the way though, I spun again to get March 11th, 1992 for the date and Phantasy Star Adventure for the game. While Phantasy Star is a pretty popular series, this game is a spin-off that came out a little after Phantasy Star 3, 3, which released in 1990 but takes place around the same time as Phantasy Star 2, which came out the year prior. It's a visual novel adventure that follows you as the main character that gets a letter from a scientist named Kim Miller who tells you about the greatest invention of the century and an enhancement machine that allows human abilities and strengths to be doubled. In the midst of the chaos, he gets kidnapped by a group named Baron Labs who wants to steal his invention, and it's your job to save him. As it is a point-and-click adventure, the gameplay isn't anything too crazy. You can move around the map, you can look at different things, talk to people, as well as take, use, and drop items. There's also combat in this game, which I'm using pretty loosely as it mainly revolved around attacking and having a dice roll decide your fate. I'll be honest, even with the game taking about 90 minutes to complete, I couldn't get through it. While most visual novels are pretty linear in a cohesive way, this one made doing simple tasks feel frustrating as the game would give little to no direction on what you had to do in some instances, so you basically had to run through the entire map going through all the prompts until something happened. My breaking point was when I got to play as another character who was helping us by the name of Lucero as I got captured at Baron Labs, so when I broke in to save myself, I had to traverse through the entirety of the building to find where my character was, only to find out I had to drop an ID through a small slot in the vents to a room that didn't even match up to where it was supposed to be according to the plot. So, as a point and click adventure, this game is fine, but as an experience, I'd have to give this a fallen star out of 10. Today we're starting with 2002 for the year and September 10th for the date. There are 4 games on today's date, but after scrambling the wheel, the game it landed on was Mania Extreme Madness. The game starts off with a CGI intro featuring a tower, the publisher, and some little egg characters before showing the title screen. There's 8 characters that you could choose from, with 4 others being unlockable through game progression, but to start off the game's campaign mode, I chose Funky the Disco Egg because why wouldn't I choose an egg with an afro? The campaign mode was similar to Mortal Kombat's Tower Gauntlet, where you had to beat random opponents to progress upwards, and every time you won you gained a life, but every time you lost one was taken away. The game itself is a puzzle game similar to Tetris, but the difference was you go against an opponent to build up a tower with the goal of building it high enough to reach a hot air balloon at the top. That being said though, there are some obstacles that stood in your way. For one, the tower's stability was super important as it was tracked with a meter, and when there were too many gaps in it, it'd start to collapse, and once it collapses down to water level, it was game over. The game also contained different power-ups such as boots that help you jump higher to grab pieces quicker, hammers you could throw at your opponent to destroy incomplete rows or knock them off their tower, cements that fill in holes in your tower, and more. One last layer of difficulty came from the levels themselves, as each one had unique enemies to avoid, such as spiders that steal your pieces, bubbles that carry you away, dragons that knock you off your tower, and the list goes on. Once I got the mechanics down, the game was pretty simple and I breezed through their over easy mode rather quickly, but immediately got humbled by their hardboiled mode and just decided to move on. My favorite mode the game had to offer though was bomb mode, where it made me focus on the bomb power up, and instead of building your tower, the main objective was to destroy your opponents by throwing bombs back and forth at each other. It definitely forces you to get familiar with the discard mechanic though, as if you pick up pieces it'll only slow you down in the long run, which basically means your run is ruined. Some other modes the game had to offer included solo, survival, and a tournament mode you could play with up to 8 people. The only other mode I didn't mention was the custom mode, which shockingly had a lot of depth to it and a bunch of other things you could change for each individual player. If you couldn't tell already, I had a blast with this game and all it had to offer. It had a good amount of variety, including 10 different stages to choose from. The mechanics didn't control bad at all, and it was pretty charming down to unique CGI scenes each character had before the matches. While I thought this game would be a yoke, it actually turned out to be an unexpected gem out of 10. For those who are unfamiliar with the series, last episode I let the most liked comment from my TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube communities decide what I'd play for the 20th episode, and the community that we landed on was TikTok that decided to pick Pirate 101 for today's game. And for those of you who are curious what the most liked game was across all platforms, it was this. Anyways, let's move on. Pirate 101 released on October 15th of 2012, which came after the success of Wizard 101 4 years prior. As a kid, I'd see commercials for the two games, but I leaned more towards Fusion Fall instead, as I loved Cartoon Network growing up and the game was completely free, so it was a no-brainer for me and my parents' wallets. But getting into Pirate 101 though, the game starts off with your setup of picking a gender, name, appearance, starter clothes, class, and adds a twist of selecting what your origin is, which actually plays a part into the gameplay, which I'll touch on later. But after getting your character, you're thrown into a quick tutorial which features you getting your first of 16 possible crewmates. I'm not sure if everyone gets the same default crewmates, but I got Subadai the Horse Barbarian to start. Shortly after that, you get thrown into the gameplay, and that has a lot to cover. To start, it's turn-based and the stats are broken down into two categories. The main categories are strength, agility, and will, and the bigger the gap is between you and your opponent in those areas, the more they matter. The other stats includes weapon power, spell power, accuracy, dodge, armor, magic resistance, and health. Every stat in this game can be boosted by items you find while battling, opening chests, and completing quests. Some items are locked behind different classes and origins, so picking those wisely plays into how your playthrough will go. One final component you have is power cards that are randomly used throughout battle to give you a competitive advantage. Now the combat itself is set on a grid and you just go up to any enemy you want to attack if you're in their range to fight them. Other things appear on the grid such as breakable crates and obstacles that get in your way to spice up the strategy a bit. You can fight with up to 4 people between crewmates or other users online who can join your battle at any time, which was great and made it feel like a cohesive online experience. Did I also mention you could do skyship fights? Your ship is fully customizable and there's an entire other leveling system dedicated just to whenever you're fighting on it. The last thing I'll touch on is the game's chapter system. Since the game has a main story, the introduction and the first part of the prologue is free, but every chapter after you can either buy on a paid membership or buy individual chapters with the game's currency of crowns that can be earned in-game or bought with real money. I feel like I'm barely scratching the surface of what this game has to offer, but the sheer amount of content and features it has is pretty remarkable. Things like player versus player, a fully voice acted cast, a bunch of side quests having pets and mounts, and a ton of world to explore. I could definitely see why some people who played this game when it launched 13 years ago would still be playing it to this day. So from the time I got to experience the game, I'd give this a golden doubloon out of 10. Make sure to follow and leave a comment which you would rate this game alongside games you hope to see in the future on this series, and I'll see you guys in the next one.